Section 21 of Hand and Ring by Anna Katharine Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 21. Heart's Martyrdom. Oh, that a man might know the end of this day's business ere it come! But it sufficeth that the day will end, and then the end is known. Julius Caesar. Mr. Ferris's first impulse upon dismissing the detectives had been to carry the note he had received to Mr. Orcutt, but a night's careful consideration of the subject convinced him that the wisest course would be to follow the suggestion conveyed in the letter, and seek a direct interview with Imogene Dare. It was not an agreeable task for him to undertake. Miss Dare was a young lady whom he had always held in the highest esteem. He had hoped to see her the wife of his friend, and would have given much from his own private stock of hope and happiness to have kept her name free from the contumely which any association with this dreadful crime must necessarily bring upon it. But his position as prosecuting attorney of the county would not allow him to consult his feelings any further in a case of such serious import. The condition of Mr. Hildreth was, to say the least, such as demanded the most impartial action on the part of the public officials, and if through any explanation of Miss Dare the one missing link in the chain of evidence against another could be supplied, it was certainly his duty to do all he could to ensure it. Accordingly, at a favorable hour the next day, he made his appearance at Mr. Orcutt's house, and learning that Miss Dare had gone to Professor Darling's house for a few days, followed her to her new home and requested an interview. She at once responded to his call. Little did he think, as she came into the parlor where he sat, and with even more than her usual calm self-possession glided down the length of that elegant apartment to his side, that she had just come from a small room on the top floor, where, in the position of a hired seamstress, she had been engaged in cutting out the wedding garments for one of the daughters of the house. Her greeting was that of a person attempting to feign a surprise she did not feel. "Ah," said she, "Mr. Ferris, this is an unexpected pleasure." But Mr. Ferris had no heart for courtesies. "Miss Dare," he began, without any of the preliminaries which might be expected of him, "I have come upon a disagreeable errand. I have a favor to ask. You are in the possession of a piece of information which it is highly necessary for me to share." "I?" The surprise betrayed in this single word was no more than was to be expected from a lady thus addressed. Neither did the face she turned so steadily toward him alter under his searching gaze. "If I can tell you anything that you wish to know," she quietly declared, "I am certainly ready to do so, sir." Deceived by the steadiness of her tone and the straightforward look of her eyes, he proceeded, with a sudden releasement from his embarrassment, to say: "I shall have to recall to your mind a most painful incident. You remember on the morning when we met at Mrs. Clemmens' house, claiming as your own a diamond ring which was picked up from the floor at your feet?" "I do." "Miss Dare, was this ring really yours, or were you misled by its appearance into merely thinking it your property? My excuse for asking this is that the ring, if not yours, is likely to become an important factor in the case to which the murder of this unfortunate woman has led." "Sir," the pause which followed the utterance of this word was but momentary, but in it what faint and final hope may have gone down into the depths of everlasting darkness God only knows. "Sir, since you ask me the question, I will say that in one sense of the term it was mine, and in another it was not. The ring was mine because it had been offered to me as a gift the day before. The ring was not mine because I had refused to take it when it was offered." At these words, spoken with such quietness they seemed like the mechanical utterance of a woman in a trance, Mr. Ferris started to his feet. He could no longer doubt that evidence of an important nature lay before him. "And may I ask," he inquired, without any idea of the martyrdom he caused, "what was the name of the person who offered you this ring, and from whom you refused to take it?" "The name?" She quavered for a moment, and her eyes flashed up toward heaven with a look of wild appeal, as if the requirement of this moment was more than even she had strength to meet. Then a certain terrible calm settled upon her, blotting the last hint of feeling from her face, and rising up in her turn, she met Mr. Ferris's inquiring eye, and slowly and distinctly replied: "It was Craik Mansell, sir. He is a nephew of Mrs. Clemmens." It was a name Mr. Ferris had come there to hear, yet it gave him a slight shock when it fell from her lips, perhaps because his mind was still running upon her supposed relations with Mr. Orcutt. But he did not show his feelings, however, and calmly asked: "And was Mr. Mansell in this town the day before the assault upon his aunt?" "He was." "And you had a conversation with him?" "I had." "May I ask where?" For the first time she flushed. Womanly shame had not yet vanished entirely from her stricken breast, but she responded as steadily as before: "In the woods, sir, back of Mrs. Clemmens' house. There were reasons," she paused, "there were good reasons, which I do not feel obliged to state, why a meeting in such a place was not discreditable to us." Mr. Ferris, who had received from other sources a full version of the interview to which she thus alluded, experienced a sudden revulsion of feeling against one he could not but consider as a detected coquette, and drawing quickly back, made a gesture such as was not often witnessed in those elegant apartments. "You mean," said he, with a sharp edge to his tone that passed over her dreary soul unheeded, "that you were lovers?" "I mean," said she, like the automaton she surely was at that moment, "that he had paid me honorable addresses, and that I had no reason to doubt his motives or my own in seeking such a meeting." "Miss Dare," all the District Attorney spoke in the manner of Mr. Ferris now, "if you refused Mr. Mansell his ring, you must have returned it to him." She looked at him with an anguish that bespoke her full appreciation of all this question implied, but unequivocally bowed her head. "It was in his possession, then," he continued, "when you left him on that day and returned to your home?" "Yes," her lips seemed to say, though no distinct utterance came from them. "And you did not see it again till you found it on the floor of Mrs. Clemmens' dining room that morning of the murder?" "No." "Miss Dare," said he, with greater mildness, after a short pause, "you have answered my somewhat painful inquiries with a straightforwardness I cannot sufficiently commend, and if you will now add to my gratitude by telling me whether you have informed any one else of the important facts you have just given me, I will distress you by no further questions." "Sir," said she, and her attitude showed that she could endure but little more, "I have taken no one else into my confidence. Such knowledge as I had to impart was not a matter for idle gossip." And Mr. Ferris, being thus assured that his own surmises and that of Hickory were correct, bowed with the respect her pale face and rigid attitude seemed to demand, and considerately left the house. Chapter 22. Of Hand and Ring by Anna Katharine Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. CHAPTER 22. Craik Mansell. Bring me unto my trial when you will. Henry VI. He is here. Mr. Ferris threw aside his cigar and looked up at Mr. Byrd, who was standing before him. You had no difficulty then? No, sir. He acted like a man in hourly expectation of some such summons. At the very first intimation of your desire to see him in Sibley, he rose from his desk with what I thought was a meaning look at Mr. Goodman, and after a few preparations for departure, signified he was ready to take the next train. And did he ask you no questions? Only one. He wished to know if I were a detective, and when I responded yes, observed with an inquiring look, I am wanted as a witness, I suppose, a suggestion to which I was careful to make no reply. Mr. Ferris pushed aside his writing and glanced toward the door. Show him in, Mr. Byrd, said he. A moment after, Mr. Mansell entered the room. The district attorney had never seen this man, and was struck at once by the force and manliness of his appearance. Half rising from his seat to greet the visitor, he said, I have to beg your pardon, Mr. Mansell. Feeling quite necessary to see you, I took the liberty of requesting you to take this journey, my own time being fully occupied at present. Mr. Mansell bowed, a slow, self-possessed bow, and advancing to the table before which the district attorney sat, laid his hand firmly upon it and said, No apologies are needed. Then shortly, what is it you want of me? The words were almost the same as those which had been used by Mr. Hildreth under similar circumstances, but how different was their effect! The one was the utterance of a weak man driven to bay, the other of a strong one. Mr. Ferris, who was by no means of an impressible organization, flashed a look of somewhat uneasy doubt at Mr. Byrd, and hesitated slightly before proceeding. We have sent for you in this friendly way, he remarked at last, in order to give you that opportunity for explaining certain matters connected with your aunt's sudden death, which your well-known character and good position seem to warrant. We think you can do this. At all events, I have accorded myself the privilege of supposing so, and any words you may have to say will meet with all due consideration. As Mrs. Clemmens' nephew, you, of course, desire to see her murderer brought to justice. The slightly rising inflection given to the last few words made them to all intents and purposes a question, and Mr. Byrd, who stood near by, waited anxiously for the decided yes which seemed the only possible reply under the circumstances, but it did not come. Surprised and possibly anxious, the district attorney repeated himself. As her nephew, said he, and the inheritor of the few savings she has left behind her, you can have but one wish on this subject, Mr. Mansell. But this attempt succeeded no better than the first. Beyond a slight compression of the lips, Mr. Mansell gave no manifestation of having heard this remark, and both Mr. Ferris and the detective found themselves forced to wonder at the rigid honesty of a man who, whatever death-giving blow he may have dealt, would not allow himself to escape the prejudice of his accusers by asserting to a supposition he knew and they knew to be false. Mr. Ferris did not press the question. Mr. Mansell, he remarked instead, a person by the name of Gouverneur Hildreth is, as you must know, under arrest at this time, charged with the crime of having given the blow that led to your aunt's death. The evidence against him is strong, and the public generally have no doubt that his arrest will lead to trial, if not to conviction. But unfortunately for us, however, fortunately for him, another person has lately been found against whom an equal show of evidence can be raised, and it is for the purposes of satisfying ourselves that it is but a show we have requested your presence here today. A spasm vivid as it was instantaneous, distorted for a moment the powerful features of Craik Mansell at the words "another person," but it was gone before the sentence was completed, and when Mr. Ferris ceased, he looked up with the steady calmness which made his bearing so remarkable. "I am waiting to hear the name of this freshly suspected person," he observed. "Cannot you imagine?" asked the District Attorney, coldly, secretly disconcerted under a gaze that held his own with such steady persistence. The eyeballs of the other flashed like coals of fire. "I think it is my right to hear it spoken," he returned. This display of feeling restored Mr. Ferris to himself. "In a moment, sir," said he. "Meanwhile, have you any objections to answering a few questions I would like to put to you?" "I will hear them," was the steady reply. "You know," said the District Attorney, "you are at perfect liberty to answer or not, as you see fit. I have no desire to entrap you into any acknowledgments you may hereafter regret." "Speak," was the sole response he received. "Well, sir," said Mr. Ferris, "are you willing to tell me where you were when you first heard of the assault which had been made upon your aunt?" "I was in my place at the mill." "And pardon me if I go too far, were you also there the morning she was murdered?" "No, sir." "Mr. Mansell, if you could tell us where you were at that time, it would be of great benefit to us and possibly to yourself." "To myself?" Having shown his surprise, or possibly his alarm, by the repetition of the other's words, Craik Mansell paused and looked slowly around the room until he encountered Mr. Byrd's eye. There was a steady compassion in the look he met there that seemed to strike him with great force, for he at once replied that he was away from home, and stopped, his glance still fixed upon Mr. Byrd, as if by the very power of his gaze he would force the secrets of that detective's soul to the surface. "Mr. Mansell," pursued the District Attorney, "a distinct avowal on your part of the place where you were at that time would be best for both of us, I am sure." "Do you not already know?" inquired the other, his eyes still upon Horace Byrd. "We have reason to think you were in this town," averred Mr. Ferris, with an emphasis calculated to recall the attention of his visitor to himself. "And may I ask," Craik Mansell quietly said, "what reason you can have for such a supposition? No one could have seen me here, for till to day I have not entered the streets of this place since my visit to my aunt 3 months ago." "It was not necessary to enter the streets of this town to effect a visit to Mrs. Clemmens' house, Mr. Mansell." "No?" There was the faintest hint of emotion in the intonation he gave to that one word, but it vanished before he spoke his next sentence. "And how," asked he, "can a person pass from Sibley Station to the door of my aunt's house without going through the streets?" Instead of replying, Mr. Ferris inquired, "Did you get out at the Sibley Station, Mr. Mansell?" But the other, with unmoved self-possession, returned, "I have not said so." "Mr. Mansell," the District Attorney now observed, "we have no motive in deceiving or even in misleading you. You were in this town on the morning of your aunt's murder, and you were even in her house. Evidence which you cannot dispute proves this, and the question that now arises, and of whose importance we leave you to judge, is whether you were there prior to the visit of Mr. Hildreth or after. Any proof you may have to show that it was before will receive its due consideration." A change, decided as it was involuntary, took place in the hitherto undisturbed countenance of Craik Mansell. Leaning forward, he surveyed Mr. Ferris with great earnestness. "I asked that man," said he, pointing with a steady forefinger at the somewhat abashed detective, "if I were not wanted here simply as a witness, and he did not say no. Now, sir," he continued, turning back with a slight gesture of disdain to the District Attorney. "Was the man right in allowing me to believe such a fact, or was he not? I would like an answer to my question before I proceed further, if you please." "You shall have it, Mr. Mansell. If this man did not answer you, it was probably because he did not feel justified in doing so. He knew I had summoned you here in the hope of receiving such explanations of your late conduct as should satisfy me you had nothing to do with your aunt's murder. The claims upon my consideration, which are held by certain persons allied with you in this matter," Mr. Ferris's look was eloquent of his real meaning here, "are my sole justification for this somewhat unusual method of dealing with a suspected man." A smile, bitter, oh how bitter in its irony, traversed the firm-set lips of Craik Mansell for a moment. Then he bowed with a show of deference to the District Attorney, and settling into the attitude of a man willing to plead his own cause, responded, "It would be more just, perhaps, if I first heard the reasons you have for suspecting me, before I attempt to advance arguments to prove the injustice of your suspicions." "Well," said Mr. Ferris, "you shall have them. If frankness on my part can do aught to avert the terrible scandal which your arrest and its consequent developments would cause, I am willing to sacrifice thus much to my friendship for Mr. Orcutt. But if I do this, I shall expect an equal frankness in return. The matter is too serious for subterfuge." The other merely waved his hand. "The reasons," proceeded Mr. Ferris, "for considering you a party as much open to suspicion as Mr. Hildreth are several. First, we have evidence to prove your great desire for a sum of money equal to your aunt's savings in order to introduce an invention which you have just patented. Secondly, we can show that you left your home in Buffalo the day before the assault, came to Monteith, the next town to this, alighted at the remote station assigned to the use of the quarrymen, crossed the hills, and threaded the woods till you came to a small hut back of your aunt's house, where you put up for the night. Thirdly, evidence is not lacking to prove that while there you visited your aunt once, if not twice, the last time on the very morning she was killed, entering the house in a surreptitious way by the back door, and leaving it in the same suspicious manner. And fourthly, we can prove that you escaped from this place as you had come, secretly, and through a difficult and roundabout path over the hills. Mr. Mansell, these facts, taken with your reticence concerning a visit so manifestly of importance to the authorities to know, must strike even you as offering grounds for a suspicion as grave as that attaching to Mr. Hildreth." With a restraint marked as it was impressive, Mr. Mansell looked at the District Attorney for a moment, and then said, "You speak of proof. Now what proof have you to give that I put up, as you call it, for a night, or even for an hour, in the hut which stands in the woods back of my aunt's house?" This was Mr. Ferris's reply. "It is known you were in the woods the afternoon previous to the assault upon your aunt, because you were seen there in company with a young lady with whom you were holding a tryst. Did you speak, sir?" "No," was the violent, almost disdainful rejoinder. "You did not sleep at your aunt's, for her rooms contained not an evidence of having been opened for a guest, and while the hut revealed more than one trace of having been used as a dormitory, I could even tell you where you cut the twigs of hemlock that served for your pillow, and point to the place where you sat when you scribbled over the margin of the Buffalo Courier with a blue pencil, such as that I now see projecting from your vest pocket." "It is not necessary," replied the young man, heavily frowning. Then, with another short glance at Mr. Ferris, he again demanded, "What is your reason for stating I visited my aunt's house on the morning she was murdered? Did any one see me do it, or does the house, like the hut, exhibit traces of my presence there at that particular time?" There was irony in his tone, and a disdain almost amounting to scorn in his wide, flashing blue eyes. But Mr. Ferris, glancing at the hand clutched about the railing of the desk, remarked quietly: "You do not wear the diamond ring you carried away with you from the tryst I mentioned. Can it be that the one which was picked up after the assault on the floor of Mrs. Clemmens' dining room could have fallen from your finger, Mr. Mansell?" A start, the first this powerfully repressed man had given, showed that his armor of resistance had been pierced at last. "How do you know," he quickly asked, "that I carried away a diamond ring from the tryst you speak of?" "Circumstances," returned the District Attorney, "prove it beyond a doubt. Miss Dare—" "Miss Dare?" Oh, the indescribable tone of this exclamation! Mr. Byrd shuddered as he heard it, and looked at Mr. Mansell with a new feeling for which he had no name. "Miss Dare," repeated the District Attorney, without apparently regarding the interruption, "acknowledges she returned you the ring which you endeavored at that interview to bestow upon her." "Ah!" The word came after a moment's pause. "I see the case has been well worked up, and it only remains for me to give you such explanations as I choose to make. Sir," declared he, stepping forward and bringing his clenched hand down upon the desk at which Mr. Ferris was sitting, "I did not kill my aunt. I admit I paid her a visit. I admit that I stayed in the woods back of her house, and even slept in the hut, as you have said. But that was on the day previous to her murder, and not after it. I went to see her for the purpose of again urging the claims of my invention upon her. I went secretly, and by the roundabout way you describe, because I had another purpose in visiting Sibley, which made it expedient for me to conceal my presence in the town. I failed in my efforts to enlist the sympathies of my aunt in regard to my plans, and I failed also in compassing that other desire of my heart of which the ring you mention was a token. Both failures unnerved me, and I lay in that hut all night. I even lay there most of the next morning, but I did not see my aunt again, and I did not lift my hand against her life." There was indescribable quiet in the tone, but there was indescribable power also, and the look he leveled upon the District Attorney was unwaveringly solemn and hard. "You deny, then, that you entered the widow's house on the morning of the murder?" "I do." "It is, then, a question of veracity between you and Miss Dare?" Silence. "She asserts she gave you back the ring you offered her. If this is so, and that ring was in your possession after you left her on Monday evening, how came it to be in the widow's dining room the next morning, if you did not carry it there?" "I can only repeat my words," rejoined Mr. Mansell. The District Attorney replied impatiently. For various reasons he did not wish to believe this man guilty. "You do not seem very anxious to assist me in my endeavors to reach the truth," he observed. "Cannot you tell me what you did with the ring after you left Miss Dare? Whether you put it on your finger, or thrust it into your pocket, or tossed it into the marsh? If you did not carry it to the house, some one else must have done so, and you ought to be able to help us in determining who." But Mr. Mansell shortly responded: "I have nothing to say about the ring. From the moment Miss Dare returned it to me, as you say, it was, so far as I am concerned, a thing forgotten. I do not know as I should ever have thought of it again if you had not mentioned it to me to day. How it vanished from my possession only to reappear upon the scene of murder, some more clever conjurer than myself must explain." "And this is all you have to say, Mr. Mansell?" "This is all I have to say." "Byrd," suggested the District Attorney, after a long pause, during which the subject of his suspicions had stood before him as rigid and inscrutable as a statue in bronze. Mr. Mansell would probably like to go to the hotel, unless, indeed, he desires to return immediately to Buffalo. Craik Mansell at once started forward. "Do you intend to allow me to return to Buffalo?" he asked. "Yes," was the District Attorney's reply. "You are a good man," broke involuntarily from the other's lips, and he impulsively reached out his hand, but as quickly drew it back with a flush of pride that greatly became him. "I do not say," quoth Mr. Ferris, "that I exempt you from surveillance. As prosecuting attorney of this district, my duty is to seek out and discover the man who murdered Mrs. Clemmens, and your explanations have not been as full or as satisfactory as I could wish." "Your men will always find me at my desk in the mill," said Mr. Mansell, coldly, and with another short bow he left the attorney's side and went quickly out. "That man is innocent," declared Mr. Ferris, as Horace Byrd leaned above him in expectation of instructions to keep watch over the departing visitor. The way in which he held out his hand to me spoke volumes. The detective cast a sad glance at Craik Mansell's retreating figure. "You could not convince Hickory of that fact," said he. Chapter 22. Of Hand and Ring by Anna Katharine Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 23. Mr. Orcutt, Part 1. What is it she does now? Macbeth. My resolution's placed. I have nothing of woman in me. Now, from head to foot, I am marble, constant. Antony and Cleopatra. These words rang in the ears of Mr. Ferris, for he felt himself disturbed by them. Hickory did not believe Mr. Mansell innocent. At last he sent for that detective. "Hickory," he asked, "why do you think Mansell, rather than Hildreth, committed this crime?" Now this query on the part of the District Attorney put Hickory into a quandary. He wished to keep his promise to Horace Byrd, and yet he greatly desired to answer his employer's questions truthfully. Without any special sympathies of his own, he had yet an undeniable leaning toward justice, and justice certainly demanded the indictment of Mansell. He ended by compromising matters. "Mr. Ferris," said he, "when you went to see Miss Dare the other day, what did you think of her state of mind?" "That it was a very unhappy one." "Did you think more than that, sir? Didn't you think she believed Mr. Mansell guilty of this crime?" "Yes," admitted the other, with reluctance. "If Miss Dare is attached to Mr. Mansell, she must feel certain of his guilt to offer testimony against him. Her belief should go for something, sir, for much, it strikes me, when you consider what a woman she is." This conversation increased Mr. Ferris's uneasiness. Much as he wished to spare the feelings of Miss Dare, and through her, those of his friend, Mr. Orcutt, the conviction of Mansell's criminality was slowly gaining ground in his mind. He remembered the peculiar manner of the latter during the interview they had held together, his quiet acceptance of the position of a suspected man, and his marked reticence in regard to the ring, though the delicate nature of the interests involved might be sufficient to explain his behavior in the latter regard. His whole conduct could not be said to be that of a disinterested man, even if it were not necessarily that of a guilty one. In whatever way Mr. Ferris looked at it, he could come to but one conclusion, and that was, the justice to Hildreth called for such official attention to the evidence which had been collected against Mansell as should secure the indictment of that man against whom could be brought the most convincing proof of guilt. Not that Mr. Ferris meant or in any wise considered it a good policy to have Mansell arrested at this time. As a friend of Mr. Orcutt, it was manifestly advisable for him to present whatever evidence he possessed against Mansell directly to the grand jury, for in this way he would not only save the lawyer from the pain and humiliation of seeing the woman he so much loved called up as a witness against the man who had successfully rivaled him in her affections, but would run the chance at least of eventually preserving from open knowledge the various details, if not the actual facts, which had led to this person being suspected of a crime. For the grand jury is a body whose business it is to make secret inquisition into criminal offences. Its members are bound by an oath to the privacy of their deliberations. If, therefore, they should find the proofs presented to them by the district attorney insufficient to authorize an indictment against Mansell, nothing of their proceedings would transpire, while, on the contrary, if they decided that the evidence was such as to oblige them to indict Mansell instead of Hildreth, neither Mr. Orcutt nor Miss Dare could hold the district attorney accountable for the exposures that must follow. The course, therefore, of Mr. Ferris was determined upon. All the evidence in his possession against both parties, together with the verdict of the coroner's jury, should go at once before the grand jury, Mansell, in the meantime, being so watched that a bench warrant issuing upon the indictment would have him safely in custody at any moment. But this plan for saving Mr. Orcutt's feelings did not succeed as fully as Mr. Ferris hoped. By some means or other, the rumor got abroad that another man than Hildreth had fallen under the suspicion of the authorities, and one day Mr. Ferris found himself stopped on the street by the very person he had for a week been endeavoring to avoid. "Mr. Orcutt," he cried, "how do you do? I did not recognize you at first." "No," was the sharp rejoinder. "I am not myself nowadays. I have a bad cold." With which impatient explanation he seized Mr. Ferris by the arm and said, "But what is this I hear? You have your eye on another party suspected of being Mrs. Clemmens' murderer?" The district attorney bowed uneasily. He had hoped to escape the discussion of this subject with Mr. Orcutt. The lawyer observed the embarrassment his question had caused, and instantly turned pale, notwithstanding the hardihood which a long career at the bar had given him. "Ferris," he pursued, in a voice he strove hard to keep steady, "we have always been good friends, in spite of the many tilts we have had together before the court. Will you be kind enough to inform me if your suspicions are founded upon evidence collected by yourself, or at the instigation of parties professing to know more about this murder than they have hitherto revealed?" Mr. Ferris could not fail to understand the true nature of this question, and out of pure friendship answered quietly, "I have allowed myself to look with suspicion upon this Mansell, for it is Mrs. Clemmens' nephew who is at present occupying our attention, because the facts which have come to light in his regard are as criminating in their nature as those which have transpired in reference to Mr. Hildreth. The examination into this matter, which my duty requires, has been anything but pleasant to me, Mr. Orcutt. The evidence of such witnesses as will have to be summoned before the grand jury is of a character to bring open humiliation, if not secret grief, upon persons of whom I entertain the highest esteem." The pointed way in which this was said convinced Mr. Orcutt that his worst fears had been realized. Turning partly away, but not losing his hold upon the other's arm, he observed with what quietness he could, "You say that so strangely. I feel forced to put another question to you. If what I have to ask strikes you with any surprise, remember that my own astonishment and perplexity at being constrained to interrogate you in this way are greater than any sensation you yourself can experience. What I desire to know is this: among the witnesses you have collected against this last suspected party, there are some women, are there not?" The District Attorney gravely bowed. "Ferris, is Miss Dare amongst them?" "Orcutt, she is." With a look that expressed his secret mistrust, the lawyer gave way to a sudden burst of feeling. "Ferris," he wrathfully acknowledged, "I may be a fool, but I don't see what she can have to say on this subject. It is impossible that she should know any thing about the murder, and as for this Mansell," he made a violent gesture with his hand, as if the very idea of her having any acquaintance with the nephew of Mrs. Clemmens were simply preposterous. The District Attorney, who saw from this how utterly ignorant the other was concerning Miss Dare's relations to the person named, felt his embarrassment increase. "Mr. Orcutt," he replied, "strange as it may appear to you, Miss Dare has testimony to give of value to the prosecution, or she would not be reckoned among its witnesses. What that testimony is, I must leave to her discretion to make known to you, as she doubtless will if you question her with sufficient consideration. I never forestall matters myself, nor would you wish me to tell you what would more becomingly come from her own lips. But, Mr. Orcutt, this I can say, that if it had been given me to choose between the two alternatives of resigning my office and pursuing an inquiry which obliges me to submit to the unpleasantness of a judicial investigation a person held in so much regard by yourself, I would have given up my office with pleasure, so keenly do I feel the embarrassment of my position and the unhappiness of yours. But any mere resignation on my part would have availed nothing to save Miss Dare from appearing before the grand jury. The evidence she has to give in this matter makes the case against Mansell as strong as that against Hildreth, and it would be the duty of any public prosecutor to recognize the fact and act accordingly." Mr. Orcutt, who had by the greatest effort succeeded in calming himself through this harangue, flashed sarcastically at this last remark, and surveyed Mr. Ferris with a peculiar look. "Are you sure," he inquired, in a slow, ironical tone, "that she has not succeeded in making it stronger?" The look, the tone, were unexpected, and greatly startled Mr. Ferris. Drawing nearer to his friend, he returned his gaze with marked earnestness. "What do you mean?" he asked, with secret anxiety. But the wary lawyer had already repented this unwise betrayal of his own doubts. Meeting his companion's eye with a calmness that amazed himself, he remarked, instead of answering: "It was through Miss Dare, then, that your attention was first drawn to Mrs. Clemmens' nephew?" "No," disclaimed Mr. Ferris, hastily. "The detectives already had their eyes upon him, but a hint from her went far toward determining me upon pursuing the matter," he allowed, seeing that his friend was determined upon hearing the truth. "So then," observed the other, with a stern dryness that recalled his manner at the bar, "she opened a communication with you herself?" "Yes." It was enough. Mr. Orcutt dropped the arm of Mr. Ferris, and with his usual hasty bow turned shortly away. The revelation which he believed himself to have received in this otherwise far from satisfactory interview was one that he could not afford to share, that is, not yet, not while any hope remained that circumstances would so arrange themselves as to make it unnecessary for him to do so. If Imogene Dare, out of her insane desire to free Gouverneur Hildreth from the suspicion that oppressed him, had resorted to perjury and invented evidence tending to show the guilt of another party, and remembering her admissions at their last interview and the language she had used in her letter of farewell, no other conclusion offered itself, What alternative was left to him but to wait till he had seen her before he proceeded to an interference that would separate her from himself by a gulf still greater than that which already existed between them? To be sure, the jealousy which consumed him, the passionate rage that seized his whole being when he thought of all she dared to do for the man she loved, or that he thought she loved, counseled him to nip this attempt of hers in the bud, and by means of a word to Mr. Ferris throw such a doubt upon her veracity as a witness against this new party should greatly influence the action of the former in the critical business he had in hand. But Mr. Orcutt, while a prey to unwonted passions, had not yet lost control of his reason, and reason told him that impulse was an unsafe guide for him to follow at this time. Thought alone, deep and concentrated thought, would help him out of this crisis with honor and safety. But thought would not come at call. In all his quick walk home, but one mad sentence formulated itself in his brain, and that was, "She loves him so, she is willing to perjure herself for his sake." Nor, though he entered his door with his usual bustling air, and went through all the customary observances of the hour with an appearance of no greater abstraction and gloom than had characterized him ever since the departure of Miss Dare, no other idea obtruded itself upon his mind than this: she loves him so, she is willing to perjure herself for his sake. Even the sight of his books, his papers, and all that various paraphernalia of work and study which gives character to a lawyer's library, was insufficient to restore his mind to its usual condition of calm thought and accurate judgment. Not till the clock struck 8, and he found himself almost without his own volition at Professor Darling's house, did he realize all the difficulties of his position, and the almost intolerable nature of the undertaking which had been forced upon him by the exigencies of the situation. Miss Dare, who had refused to see him at first, came into his presence with an expression that showed him with what reluctance she had finally responded to his peremptory message. But in the few heavy moments he had been obliged to wait, he had schooled himself to expect coldness, if not absolute rebuff. He therefore took no heed of the haughty air of inquiry with which she turned upon him, but came at once to the point, saying almost before she had closed the door, "What is this you have been doing, Imogene?" A flush, such as glints across the face of a marble statue, visited for a moment the still whiteness of her set features. Then she replied: "Mr. Orcutt, when I left your house, I told you I had a wretched and unhappy duty to perform, that, when once accomplished, would separate us forever. I have done it, and the separation has come. Why attempt to bridge it?" There was a sad weariness in her tone, a sad weariness in her face, but he seemed to recognize neither. The demon jealousy, that hindrance to all unselfish feelings, had gripped him again, and the words that came to his lips were at once bitter and masterful. "Imogene," he cried, with as much wrath in his tone as he had ever betrayed in her presence, "you do not answer my question. I ask you, what have you been doing? And you reply your duty. Now, what do you mean by duty? Tell me at once and distinctly, for I will no longer be put off by any roundabout phrases concerning a matter of such vital importance." "Tell you?" This repetition of his words had a world of secret anguish in it which he could not help but notice. She did not succumb to it, however, but continued in another moment. "You said to me, in the last conversation we held together, that Gouverneur Hildreth could not be released from his terrible position without a distinct proof of innocence or the advancement of such evidence against another as should turn suspicion aside from him into a new and more justifiable quarter. I could not, any more than he, give a distinct proof of his innocence, but I could furnish the authorities with testimony calculated to arouse suspicion in a fresh direction, and I did it. For Gouverneur Hildreth had to be saved at any price, at any price. The despairing emphasis she laid upon the last phrase went like hot steel to Mr. Orcutt's heart, and made his eyes blaze with almost uncontrollable passion. "Je ne vois pas la nécessité," said he, in that low, restrained tone of bitter sarcasm which made his invective so dreaded by opposing counsel. "If Gouverneur Hildreth finds himself in an unfortunate position, he has only his own follies and inordinate desire for this woman's death to thank for it. Because you love him and compassionate him beyond all measure, that is no reason why you should perjure yourself and throw the burden of shame upon a man as innocent as Mr. Mansell." But this tone, though it had made many a witness quail before it, neither awed nor intimidated her. You do not understand," came from her white lips. "It is Mr. Hildreth who is perfectly innocent, and not—" But here she paused. "You will excuse me from saying more," she said. "You, as a lawyer, ought to know that I should not be compelled to speak on a subject like this except under oath." End of chapter 23, part 1. Of Hand and Ring by Anna Katharine Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 23, Mr. Orcutt, Part 2. Imogene. A change had passed over Mr. Orcutt. "Imogene, do you mean to affirm that you really have charges to make against Craik Mansell, that this evidence you propose to give is real, and not manufactured for the purpose of leading suspicion aside from Hildreth?" It was an insinuation against her veracity he never could have made or she have listened to a few weeks before, but the shield of her pride was broken between them, and neither he nor she seemed to give any thought to the reproach conveyed in these words. "What I have to say is the truth," she murmured. "I have not manufactured anything." With an astonishment he took no pains to conceal, Mr. Orcutt anxiously surveyed her. He could not believe this was so. Yet how could he convict her of falsehood in the face of that suffering expression of resolve which she wore? His methods as a lawyer came to his relief. "Imogene," he slowly responded, "if, as you say, you are in possession of positive evidence against this Mansell, how comes it that you jeopardize the interest of the man you love by so long withholding your testimony?" But instead of a flush of confusion which he expected, she flashed upon him with a sudden revelation of feeling that made him involuntarily start. "Shall I tell you?" she replied. "You will have to know sometime, and why not now?" "I kept back the truth," she replied, advancing a step, but without raising her eyes to his, "because it is not the aspersed Hildreth that I love, but—" Why did she pause? What was it she found so hard to speak? Mr. Orcutt's expression became terrible. "But the other," she murmured at last. "The other?" It was now her turn to start and look at him in surprise, if not in some fear. "What other?" he cried, seizing her by the hand. "Name him. I will have no further misunderstanding between us." "Is it necessary?" she asked with bitterness. "Will Heaven spare me nothing?" Then, as she saw no relenting in the fixed gaze that held her own, whispered in a hollow tone, "You have just spoken the name yourself, Craik Mansell." "Ah!" Incredulity, anger, perplexity, all the emotions that were seething in this man's troubled soul, spoke in that simple exclamation. Then silence settled upon the room, during which she gained control over herself, and he the semblance of it no more. She was the first to speak. "I know," said she, "that this avowal on my part seems almost incredible to you, but it is no more so than that which you so readily received from me the other day in reference to Gouverneur Hildreth. A woman who spends a month away from home makes acquaintances which she does not always mention when she comes back. I saw Mr. Mansell in Buffalo," and turning, she confronted the lawyer with her large gray eyes, in which a fire burned such as he had never seen there before, "and grew to esteem him," she went on. "For the first time in my life I found myself in the presence of a man whose nature commanded mine. His ambition, his determination, his unconventional and forcible character woke aspirations within me such as I had never known myself capable of before. Life, which had stretched out before me with a somewhat monotonous outlook, changed to a panorama of varied and wonderful experiences, as I listened to his voice and met the glance of his eye, and soon, before he knew it, and certainly before I realized it, words of love passed between us, and the agony of that struggle began which has ended. Ah, let me not think how, or I shall go mad." Mr. Orcutt, who had watched her with a lover's fascination during all this attempted explanation, shivered for a moment at this last bitter cry of love and despair, but spoke up when he did speak with a coldness that verged on severity. "So you loved another man when you came back to my house, and listened to the words of passion which came from my lips, and the hopes of future bliss and happiness that welled up from my heart?" "Yes," she whispered, "and, as you will remember, I tried to suppress those hopes and turn a deaf ear to those words, though I had but little prospect of marrying a man whose fortunes depended upon the success of an invention he could persuade no one to believe in." "Yet you brought yourself to listen to those hopes on the afternoon of the murder," he suggested ironically. "Can you blame me for that?" she cried, remembering how you pleaded, and what a revulsion of feeling I was laboring under. A smile bitter as the fate which loomed before him, and scornful as the feelings that secretly agitated his breast, parted Mr. Orcutt's pale lips for an instant, and he seemed about to give utterance to some passionate rejoinder, but he subdued himself with a determined effort, and quietly waiting till his voice was under full control, remarked with lawyer-like brevity at last: "You have not told me what evidence you have to give against young Mansell." Her answer came with equal brevity, if not equal quietness. "No, I have told Mr. Ferris. Is not that enough?" But he did not consider it so. "Ferris is a district attorney," said he, "and has demanded your confidence for the purposes of justice, while I am your friend. The action you have taken is peculiar, and you may need advice, but how can I give it, or how can you receive it, unless there is a complete understanding between us?" Struck in spite of herself, moved perhaps by a hope she had not allowed herself to contemplate before, she looked at him long and earnestly. "And do you really wish to help me?" she inquired. "Are you so generous as to forgive the pain, and possibly the humiliation, I have inflicted upon you, and lend me your assistance in case my testimony works its due effect, and he be brought to trial instead of Mr. Hildreth?" It was a searching and pregnant question, for which Mr. Orcutt was possibly not fully prepared, but his newly gained self-control did not give way. "I must insist upon hearing the facts before I say anything of my intentions," he averred. "Whatever they may be, they cannot be more startling in their character than those which have been urged against Hildreth." "But they are," she whispered. Then, with a quick look around her, she put her mouth close to Mr. Orcutt's ear and breathed: Mr. Hildreth is not the only man who, unseen by the neighbors, visited Mrs. Clemmens' house on the morning of the murder. Craik Mansell was there also." "Craik Mansell? How do you know that? Ah," he pursued, with the scornful intonation of a jealous man, "I forgot you are lovers." The sneer, natural as it was, perhaps, seemed to go to her heart and wake its fiercest indignation. "Hush!" cried she, towering upon him with an ominous flash of her proud eyes. "Do not turn the knife in that wound, or you will seal my lips forever." And she moved hastily away from his side. But in another instant she determinedly returned, saying: "This is no time for indulging in one's sensibilities. I affirm that Craik Mansell visited his aunt on that day, because the ring which was picked up on the floor of her dining room, you remember the ring, Mr. Orcutt?" Remember it? Did he not? All his many perplexities in its regard crowded upon him as he made a hurried bow of acquiescence. "It belonged to him," she continued. "He had bought it for me, or rather had had the diamond reset for me. It had been his mother's. Only the day before he had tried to put it on my finger in a meeting we had in the woods back of his aunt's house, but I refused to allow him. The prospect ahead was too dismal and unrelenting for us to betroth ourselves, whatever our hopes or wishes might be." "You had a meeting with this man in the woods the day before his aunt was assaulted?" echoed Mr. Orcutt, turning upon her with an amazement that swallowed up his wrath. "Yes." "And he afterward visited her house?" "Yes." "And he dropped that ring there?" "Yes." Starting slowly, as if the thoughts roused by this short statement of facts were such as demanded instant consideration, Mr. Orcutt walked to the other side of the room, where he paced up and down in silence for some minutes. When he returned, it was the lawyer instead of the lover who stood before her. "Then it was the simple fact of finding this gentleman's ring on the floor of Mrs. Clemmens' dining room that makes you consider him the murderer of his aunt?" he asked, with a tinge of something like irony in his tone. "No," she breathed, rather than answered. "That was proof, of course, that he had been there, but I should never have thought of it as evidence of guilt if the woman herself had not uttered in our hearing that telltale exclamation of 'ring and hand,' and if, in the talk I had with Mr. Mansell the day before, he had not betrayed "Why do you stop me?" she whispered. "I did not stop you," he hastily assured her. "I am too anxious to hear what you have to say. Go on, Imogene. What did this Mansell betray? I ask as a father might," he added, with some dignity and no little effort. But her fears had taken alarm, or her caution had been aroused, and she merely said: "The $5,000 which his aunt leaves him is just the amount he desired to start him in life." "Did he wish such an amount?" Mr. Orcutt asked. "Very much." "And acknowledged it in the conversation he had with you?" "Yes." "Imogene," declared the lawyer, "if you do not want to insure Mr. Mansell's indictment, I would suggest to you not to lay too great stress upon any talk you may have held with him." But she cried with unmoved sternness, and a relentless crushing down of all emotion that was at once amazing and painful to see. "The innocent is to be saved from the gallows, no matter what the fate of the guilty may be." And a short but agitated silence followed, which Mr. Orcutt broke at last by saying: "Are these all the facts you have to give me?" She started, cast him a quick look, bowed her head, and replied: "Yes." There was something in the tone of this assertion that made him repeat his question: "Are these all the facts you have to give me?" Her answer came ringing and emphatic now. "Yes," she avowed, "all." With a look of relief, slowly smoothing out the deep furrows of his brow, Mr. Orcutt, for the second time, walked thoughtfully away in evident consultation with his own thoughts. This time he was gone so long, the suspense became almost intolerable to Imogene. Feeling that she could endure it no longer, she followed him at last, and laid her hand upon his arm. "Speak," she impetuously cried. "Tell me what you think, what I have to expect." But he shook his head. "Wait," he returned. "Wait till the grand jury has brought in a bill of indictment. It will, doubtless, be against one of these two men, but I must know which before I can say or do anything." "And do you think there can be any doubt about which of these two it will be?" she inquired, with sudden emotion. "There is always doubt," he rejoined, "about anything or everything a body of men may do. This is a very remarkable case, Imogene," he resumed, with increased somberness, "the most remarkable one, perhaps, that has ever come under my observation. What the grand jury will think of it, upon which party, Mansell or Hildreth, the weight of their suspicion will fall, neither I nor Ferris nor any other man can prophesy with any assurance. The evidence against both is, in so far as we know, entirely circumstantial. That you believe Mr. Mansell to be the guilty party—" "Believe?" she murmured. "I know it." "That you believe him to be the guilty party," the wary lawyer pursued, as if he had not heard her, "does not imply that they will believe it too. Hildreth comes of a bad stock, and his late attempt at suicide tells wonderfully against him. Yet the facts you have to give in Mansell's disfavor are strong, also, and Heaven only knows what the upshot will be. However, a few weeks will determine all that, and then—" Pausing, he looked at her, and as he did so, the austerity and self-command of the lawyer vanished out of sight, and the passionate gleam of a fierce and overmastering love shone again in his eyes. "And then," he cried, "then we will see what Tremont Orcutt can do to bring order out of this chaos." There was so much resolve in his look, such a hint of promise in his tone, that she flushed with something almost akin to hope. "Oh, generous!" she began. But he stopped her before she could say more. "Wait," he repeated. "Wait till we see what action will be taken by the grand jury." And taking her hand, he looked earnestly, if not passionately, into her face. "Imogene," he commenced, "if I should succeed—" But there he himself stopped short, with a quick recalling of his own words, perhaps. "No," he cried, "I will say no more till we see which of these two men is to be brought to trial." And pressing her hand to his lips, he gave her one last look in which was concentrated all the secret passions which had been called forth by this hour, and hastily left the room. End of chapter 23, part 2. Section 25 of Hand and Ring by Anna Katharine Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 24. A True Bill. Come to me, friend or foe, and tell me who is victor, York or Warwick. Henry VI. The town of Sibley was in a state of excitement. About the courthouse, especially, the crowd was great and the interest manifested intense. The grand jury was in session, and the case of the widow Clemmens was before it. As all the proceedings of this body are private, the suspense of those interested in the issue was naturally very great. The name of the man lastly suspected of the crime had transpired, and both Hildreth and Mansell had their partisans, though the mystery surrounding the latter made his friends less forward in asserting his innocence than those of the more thoroughly understood Hildreth. Indeed, the ignorance felt on all sides as to the express reasons for associating the name of Mrs. Clemmens' nephew with his aunt's murder added much to the significance of the hour. Conjectures were plenty and the wonder great. But the causes why this man, or any other, should lie under a suspicion equal to that raised against Hildreth at the inquest was a mystery that none could solve. But what is the curiosity of the rabble to us? Our interest is in a little room far removed from this scene of excitement, where the young daughter of Professor Darling kneels by the side of Imogene Dare, striving by caresses and entreaty to win a word from her lips or a glance from her heavy eyes. "Imogene," she pleaded, "Imogene, what is this terrible grief? Why did you have to go to the courthouse this morning with papa? Why have you been almost dead with terror and misery ever since you got back? Tell me, or I shall perish of mere fright. For weeks now, ever since you were so good as to help me with my wedding clothes, I have seen that something dreadful was weighing upon your mind. But this which you are suffering now is awful. This I cannot bear. Can you not speak, dear? Words will do you good." Words? Oh, the despair, the bitterness of that single exclamation! Miss Darling drew back in dismay. As if released, Imogene rose to her feet and surveyed the sweet and ingenuous countenance uplifted to her own, with a look of faint recognition of the womanly sympathy it conveyed. "Helen," she resumed, "you are happy. Do not stay here with me, but go where there are cheerfulness and hope." "But I cannot while you suffer so. I love you, Imogene. Would you drive me away from your side when you are so unhappy? You don't care for me as I do for you, or you could not do it." "Helen," the deep tone made the sympathetic little bride-elect quiver. "Helen, some griefs are best borne alone. Only a few hours now, and I shall know the worst. Leave me." But the gentle little creature was not to be driven away. She only clung the closer and pleaded the more earnestly. "Tell me, tell me." The reiteration of this request was too much for the pallid woman before her. Laying her two hands on the shoulders of this child, she drew back and looked her earnestly in the face. "Helen," she cried, "what do you know of earthly anguish? A petted child, the favorite of happy fortune, you have been kept from evil as from a blight. None of the annoyances of life have been allowed to enter your path, much less its griefs and sins. Terror with you is but a name, remorse an unknown sensation. Even your love has no depths in it such as suffering gives. Yet, since you do love, and love well, perhaps you can understand something of what a human soul can endure who sees its only hope and only love tottering above a gulf too horrible for words to describe, a gulf, too, which her own hand— But no, I cannot tell you. I overrated my strength. She sank back, but the next moment started again to her feet. A servant had opened the door. "What is it?" she exclaimed. "Speak, tell me." "Only a gentleman to see you, miss." "Only a—" But she stopped in that vain repetition of the girl's simple words, and looked at her as if she would force from her lips the name she had not the courage to demand, but failing to obtain it, turned away to the glass, where she quietly smoothed her hair and adjusted the lace at her throat, and then catching sight of the tear-stained face of Helen, stooped and gave her a kiss, after which she moved mechanically to the door and went down those broad flights, one after one, till she came to the parlor, where she went in and encountered Mr. Orcutt. A glance at his face told her all she wanted to know. "Ah!" she gasped. "It is then Mansell." It was 5 minutes later. Imogene leaned against the window, where she had withdrawn herself at the utterance of that one word. Mr. Orcutt stood a couple of paces behind her. "Imogene," said he, "there is a question I would like to have you answer." The feverish agitation expressed in his tone made her look around. "Put it," she mechanically replied. But he did not find it easy to do this, while her eyes rested upon him in such despair. He felt, however, that the doubt in his mind must be satisfied at all hazards, so choking down an emotion that was almost as boundless as her own, he ventured to ask: "Is it among the possibilities that you could ever again contemplate giving yourself in marriage to Craik Mansell, no matter what the issue of the coming trial may be?" A shudder, quick and powerful as that which follows the withdrawal of a dart from an agonizing wound, shook her whole frame for a moment, but she answered steadily: "No. How can you ask, Mr. Orcutt?" A gleam of relief shot across his somewhat haggard features. "Then," he said, "it will be no treason in me to assure you that never has my love been greater for you than to day; that to save you from the pain which you are suffering, I would sacrifice everything, even my pride. If, therefore, there is any kindness I can show you, any deed I can perform for your sake, I am ready to attempt it, Imogene." "Would you?" She hesitated, but gathered courage as she met his eye. "Would you be willing to go to him with a message from me?" His glance fell, and his lips took a line that startled Imogene, but his answer, though given with bitterness, was encouraging. "Yes," he returned, "even that." "Then," she cried, "tell him that to save the innocent I had to betray the guilty, but in doing this I did not spare myself; that whatever his doom may be, I shall share it, even though it be that of death." "Imogene!" "Will you tell him?" she asked. But he would not have been a man, much less a lover, if he could answer that question now. Seizing her by the arm, he looked her wildly in the face. "Do you mean to kill yourself?" he demanded. "I feel I shall not live," she gasped, while her hand went involuntarily to her heart. He gazed at her in horror. "And if he is cleared?" he hoarsely ejaculated. I shall try to endure my fate." He gave her another long look. "So this is the alternative you give me," he bitterly exclaimed. "I must either save this man or see you perish. Well," he declared, after a few minutes' further contemplation of her face, "I will save this man, that is, if he will allow me to do so." A flash of joy, such as he had not perceived on her countenance for weeks, transformed its marble-like severity into something of its pristine beauty. "And you will take him my message also?" she cried. But to this he shook his head. "If I am to approach him as a lawyer willing to undertake his cause, don't you see I can give him no such message as that?" "Ah, yes, yes. But you can tell him Imogene Dare has risked her own life and happiness to save the innocent." "I will tell him whatever I can to show your pity and your misery." And she had to content herself with this. In the light of the new hope that was thus unexpectedly held out to her, it did not seem so difficult. Giving Mr. Orcutt her hand, she endeavored to thank him, but the reaction from her long suspense was too much, and for the first time in her brave young life Imogene lost consciousness and fainted quite away. End of chapter 24. Section 26 of Hand and Ring by Anna Katharine Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 25. Among Telescopes and Charts. Tarry a little. There is something else. Merchant of Venice. Gouverneur Hildreth was discharged and Craik Mansell committed to prison to await his trial. Horace Byrd, who no longer had any motive for remaining in Sibley, had completed all his preparations to return to New York. His valise was packed, his adieus made, and nothing was left for him to do but step around to the station, when he bethought him of a certain question he had not put to Hickory. Seeking him out, he propounded it. "Hickory," said he, "have you ever discovered in the course of your inquiries where Miss Dare was on the morning of the murder?" The stalwart detective, who was in a very contented frame of mind, answered up with great cheeriness. "Haven't I, though? It was one of the very first things I made sure of. She was at Professor Darling's house on Summer Avenue." "At Professor Darling's house?" Mr. Byrd felt a sensation of dismay. Professor Darling's house was, as you remember, in almost direct communication with Mrs. Clemmens' cottage by means of a path through the woods. As Mr. Byrd recalled his first experience in threading those woods, and remembered with what suddenness he had emerged from them only to find himself in full view of the west side and Professor Darling's spacious villa, he stared uneasily at his colleague and said: "It is train time, Hickory, but I cannot help that. Before I leave this town I must know just what she was doing on that morning, and whom she was with. Can you find out?" "Can I find out?" The hardy detective was out of the door before the last word of this scornful repetition had left his lips. He was gone an hour. When he returned, he looked very much excited. "Well," he ejaculated breathlessly, "I have had an experience." Mr. Byrd gave him a look, saw something he did not like in his face, and moved uneasily in his chair. "You have?" he retorted. "What is it? Speak." "Do you know," the other resumed, "that the hardest thing I ever had to do was to keep my head down in the hut the other day, and deny myself a look at the woman who could bear herself so bravely in the midst of a scene so terrible. Well," he went on, "I have to day been rewarded for my self-control. I have seen Miss Dare." Horace Byrd could scarcely restrain his impatience. "Where?" he demanded. "How? Tell a fellow, can't you?" "I'm going to," protested Hickory. "Cannot you wait a minute? I had to wait 40. "Well," he continued more pleasantly, as he saw the other frown, "I went to Professor Darling's. There is a girl there I have talked to before, and I had no difficulty in seeing her or getting a 5 minutes' chat with her at the back gate. Odd how such girls will talk. She told me in 3 minutes all I wanted to know. Not that it was so much, only—" "Do get on," interrupted Mr. Byrd. "When did Miss Dare come to the house on the morning Mrs. Clemmens was murdered, and what did she do while there?" "She came early, by 10 o'clock or so, I believe, and she sat, if she did sit, in an observatory they have at the top of the house, a place where she often used to go, I am told, to study astronomy with Professor Darling's oldest daughter." "And was Miss Darling with her that morning? Did they study together all the time she was in the house?" "No, that is, the girl said no one went up to the observatory with Miss Dare, that Miss Darling did not happen to be at home that day, and Miss Dare had to study alone. Hearing this," pursued Hickory, answering the look of impatience on the other's face, "I had a curiosity to interview the observatory, and being, well, not a clumsy fellow at soft soaping a girl, I at last succeeded in prevailing upon her to take me up. Byrd, will you believe me when I tell you that we did it without going into the house?" "What?" "I mean," corrected the other, "without entering the main part of the building. The Professor's house has a tower, you know, at the upper angle toward the woods, and it is in the top of that tower he keeps his telescopes, and all that kind of thing. The tower has a special staircase of its own. It is a spiral one, and opens on a door below that connects directly with the garden. We went up these stairs." "You dared to go?" "Yes. The girl assured me every one was out of the house but the servants, and I believed her. We went up the stairs, entered the observatory—" "Is it not kept locked, then?" "It was not locked to day. saw the room, which is a curious one, glanced out over the view, which is well worth seeing, and then—" "Well, what?" "I believe I stood still and asked the girl a question or two more. I inquired," he went on, deprecating the other's impatience by a wave of his nervous hand, "when Miss Dare came down from this place on the morning, you remember." She answered that she couldn't quite tell, that she wouldn't have remembered anything at all about it all, only that Miss Tremaine came to the house that morning, and wanting to see Miss Dare, ordered her to go up to the observatory and tell that lady to come down, and that she went, but to her surprise did not find Miss Dare there, though she was sure she had not gone home, or at least hadn't taken any of the cars that start from the front of the house, for she had looked at them every one as they went by the basement window where she was at work. "The girl said this?" "Yes, standing in the door of this small room and looking me straight in the eye." "And did you ask her nothing more? Say nothing about the time, Hickory, or inquire where she supposed Miss Dare to have gone?" "Yes, I asked her all this. I am not without curiosity any more than you are, Mr. Byrd." "And she replied?" "Oh, as to the time, that it was somewhere before noon. Her reason for being sure of this was that Miss Tremaine declined to wait till another effort had been made to find Miss Dare, saying she had an engagement at 12 which she did not wish to break." "And the girl's notions about where Miss Dare had gone?" "Such as you expect, Byrd. She said she did not know anything about it, but that Miss Dare often went strolling in the garden or even in the woods when she came to Professor Darling's house, and that she supposed she had gone off on some such walk at this time, for at 1 o'clock or thereabouts she saw her pass in the horse car on her way back to town." "Hickory, I wish you had not told me this just as I am going back to the city." "Wish I had not told it, or wish I had not gone to Professor Darling's house as you requested?" "Wish you had not told it. I dare not wish the other. But you spoke of seeing Miss Dare. How was that? Where did you run across her?" "Do you want to hear?" "Of course, of course." "But I thought—" "Oh, never mind, old boy. Tell me the whole now, as long as you have told me any. Was she in the house?" "I will tell you. I had asked the girl all these questions, as I have said, and was about to leave the observatory and go below, when I thought I would cast another glance around the curious old place, and in doing so caught a glimpse of a huge portfolio of charts, as I supposed, standing upright in a rack that stretched across the further portion of the room. Somehow my heart misgave me when I saw this rack, and scarcely conscious what it was I feared, I crossed the floor and looked behind the portfolio. Byrd, there was a woman crouched there, a woman whose pallid cheeks and burning eyes, lifted to meet my own, told me only too plainly that it was Miss Dare. I have had many experiences," Hickory allowed after a moment, "and some of them anything but pleasant to myself, but I don't think I ever felt just as I did at that instant. I believe I attempted a bow, I don't remember, or at least tried to murmur some excuse, but the look that came into her face paralyzed me, and I stopped before I had gotten very far, and waited to hear what she would say. But she did not say much. She merely rose, and turning toward me, exclaimed, 'No apologies. You are a detective, I suppose?' And when I nodded, or made some other token that she had guessed correctly, she merely remarked, flashing upon me, however, in a way I do not yet understand, 'Well, you have got what you desired, and now can go.' And I went, Byrd, went, and I felt puzzled, I don't know why, and a little bit sore about the heart, too, as if— well, I can't even tell what I mean by that if. The only thing I am sure of is that Mansell's cause hasn't been helped by this day's job, and that if this lady is asked on the witness stand where she was during the hour every one believed her to be safely shut up with the telescopes and charts, we shall hear what? Well, that she was shut up with them, most likely. Women like her are not too easily disconcerted, even on the witness stand. End of chapter 25. Section 27 of Hand and Ring by Anna Katharine Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 26. He Shall Hear Me. There's some ill planet's reigns. I must be patient till the heavens look with an aspect more favorable. Winter's Tale. The time is midnight. The day the same as that which saw this eruption of hickory into Professor Darling's observatory. The scene, that of Miss Dare's own room in the northeast tower. She is standing before a table with a letter in her hand and a look upon her face that, if seen, would have added much to the puzzlement of the detectives. The letter was from Mr. Orcutt, and ran thus: I have seen Mr. Mansell, and have engaged myself to undertake his defence. When I tell you that out of the hundreds of cases I have tried in my still short life, I have lost but a small percentage, you will understand what this means. In pursuance to your wishes, I mentioned your name to the prisoner with an intimation that I had a message from you to deliver, but he stopped me before I could utter a word. I received no communication from Miss Dare, he declared, and anxious as I really was to do your bidding, I was compelled to refrain, for his tone was one of hatred, and his look that of ineffable scorn. This was all, but it was enough. Imogene had read these words over 3 times, and now was ready to plunge the letter into the flame of a candle to destroy it. As it burned, her grief and indignation took words. He is alienated, completely alienated, she gasped, and I do not wonder. But, and here the full majesty of her nature broke forth in one grand gesture, he shall hear me yet. As there is a God above, he shall hear me yet, even if it has to be in open court and in the presence of judge and jury. End of chapter 26.